The story begins inside a nice restaurant in Chicago where Lila Kensington is celebrating her 25th birthday. She is sitting at a decorated table with her adoptive parents, George and Patricia Kensington, along with a few close relatives. There are candles on the cake, soft music playing, and people around them enjoying their meals. At first, everything looks normal, even peaceful. Lila smiles politely, trying to enjoy the moment, even though there has always been a strange distance between her and her parents. But that peace does not last long. In the middle of the dinner, George suddenly pushes his chair back and stands up. The room slowly becomes quiet as people start noticing him. He looks at Lila with a cold expression, as if he has already made a final decision in his mind. Then he says something that changes everything. In a firm voice, he announces that Lila is no longer their daughter. He says she has always been a disappointment and that they are done with her. The entire restaurant goes silent. Even the waiters stop moving. People at nearby tables start turning their heads, shocked by what they just heard. Lila feels her heart drop. She cannot understand what is happening or why her own father would humiliate her like this in public on her birthday. Before she can even respond, Patricia also stands up. Her face shows no emotion, only frustration and distance. She looks at Lila and tells her to leave immediately. She adds that Lila should never return to their home again and that this is the end of everything between them. Lila sits frozen for a moment, trying to process the words. Her hands shake slightly as she looks around the restaurant and sees strangers watching her pain. Her birthday cake is still untouched, but her world already feels broken. Slowly, she realizes that the people she called family have just erased her from their lives in front of everyone. That night, inside a crowded restaurant filled with strangers, Lila Kensington's life changes completely in just a few minutes. Lila stayed seated even after her parents stopped speaking. She could still hear the soft noise of people whispering around her, but it felt far away, like she was trapped inside a bubble that no one else could enter. Her chest felt tight, and her hands were still shaking under the table. She tried to focus on anything except the words that had just been thrown at her, but it was impossible. That's when she noticed something strange. Just a few steps away, another table was arranged differently from the rest. It wasn't loud or festive like the other groups in the restaurant. Instead, it felt heavy, almost serious. A small family sat there, but no one was smiling or eating properly. They looked like they were waiting for something, or someone. Their eyes kept moving around the room again and again, as if searching for a face they had been hoping to see for a long time. Lila didn't mean to stare, but something about them pulled her attention. The energy was different. While her own table had turned into humiliation, that table felt like unfinished emotion. Then she saw her. A woman sitting near the edge of that group kept looking directly at Lila. Not once or twice, but again and again. It wasn't a normal glance. It was intense, shaky, like she was trying to confirm something she didn't fully trust. Her lips were slightly parted, and her hands were pressed tightly together on the table. She looked like she was holding back words. Lila felt uncomfortable and looked away, but every time she glanced back, the woman was still staring at her. Not in a rude way, but in a way that felt almost painful. Like seeing someone you lost a long time ago and never expected to find again. One of the men at that table leaned forward and whispered something, following the woman's gaze. Then he also looked at Lila. His expression changed instantly, like he had recognized a memory he couldn't explain. Lila's heart started beating faster. She didn't understand why strangers would react to her like this on the worst night of her life. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just coincidence, just stress in the air. But the way that woman kept staring didn't feel like coincidence at all. It felt like recognition that had been buried for years and was now struggling to come out. Patricia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She didn't raise it, but it carried enough weight to make everyone stop talking. She looked at Lila with a cold, distant expression and said she should leave immediately. She added that Lila had already brought enough shame to their family name and had no place sitting there any longer. For a moment, Lila didn't move. It felt like her body didn't fully understand what was being asked of her. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table as she looked at her adoptive mother, searching for even a small sign that this might be a misunderstanding. But there was nothing there. Only finality. Slowly, the noise in the restaurant began to return, but it wasn't normal anymore. It was filled with whispers. People at nearby tables were no longer pretending not to listen. Some were openly staring. Others exchanged quiet looks, like they had just witnessed something uncomfortable but couldn't look away. Lila pushed her chair back. The sound of it scraping the floor felt louder than it should have. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, as if she might fall at any second. Her dress suddenly felt too tight, her skin too warm, like the entire room was pressing in on her. No one spoke to her. No one stopped her. Even the relatives who came with her parents avoided her eyes. That silence hurt more than the words. As she took her first step away from the table, she could feel every gaze following her movement. It wasn't just pity. It was curiosity, judgment, and something close to disbelief, like she had become part of a scene they didn't expect to witness during dinner. She passed between tables, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound of cutlery and low conversation continued around her, but it felt distant, unreal. Someone near the entrance shifted in their seat to get a better look at her face. Lila kept her head down, but she could still feel the attention clinging to her. Her birthday cake was still untouched behind her, candles likely still standing, waiting for a celebration that would never happen. When she finally reached the door, she paused for half a second. Not because she wanted to stay, but because it felt like the moment she stepped outside, something inside her would be left behind forever. Then she walked out, leaving the restaurant, the noise, and the life she thought she had, all behind her in a single breath. Outside, the cold air hit Lila's face the moment she stepped out, but it didn't calm her down. She sat on a wooden bench a few feet from the entrance, trying to breathe slowly, but her chest kept tightening like it wouldn't listen to her. Her hands were still trembling, so she wrapped her arms around herself, as if that could hold the pieces together. The sounds from inside the restaurant were muffled now, just faint music and distant chatter through the walls. But the silence outside felt worse. It gave her too much space to think about everything that had just happened, and she didn't want to think at all. She lowered her head for a moment, then looked up again without meaning to. Through the large glass window, she could still see inside clearly. Most tables had gone back to normal, people continuing their dinners as if nothing had happened. But one table still felt different. The reunion group was still there. They weren't laughing or eating anymore. Something had shifted. Their earlier quiet tension had turned into visible distress. One woman had her hand over her mouth, her eyes red like she had been crying. Another person leaned forward with both elbows on the table, head lowered, as if struggling to process something painful. Lila watched them without understanding why she couldn't look away. Then she noticed movement. A man from that table suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. His posture was tense, like he had made a decision he couldn't sit with anymore. For a second, he looked toward the exit, directly in Lila's direction. It felt like he wanted to come outside, like something inside him was pushing him forward. But before he could take a step, another person grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. The gesture was quick but firm, almost desperate. The man resisted slightly, then stopped, but his eyes stayed fixed in Lila's direction. Lila's breath caught without her realizing it. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but it didn't feel random. The entire table seemed affected by something she couldn't hear or know. The man finally sat back down, but the energy didn't settle. If anything, it became heavier, like they were all holding in something too big to speak. Lila slowly turned her gaze away from the window, but the feeling stayed with her. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It felt like she had stepped into something she didn't belong to, yet somehow was deeply connected to. Lila was still sitting on the bench when the side door of the restaurant opened and a waiter stepped out. He looked younger, maybe in his early 20s, and he carried a tray in one hand like he had forgotten to fully leave work behind. He glanced around quickly, then noticed Lila sitting there alone. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to ignore her and keep walking, but something about the situation made him slow down. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable, like he had been holding something in for a while. "You okay?" he asked quietly, but Lila didn't answer right away. She just nodded slightly without looking at him. He exhaled and leaned against the wall near the door, like he needed a break from everything inside. The noise from the restaurant spilled out behind him for a second, clinking glasses, distant laughter, but it felt like it belonged to another world. Then he spoke again, lower this time. "That table inside, the reunion group, they'd been here for hours." Lila didn't react at first. Her mind was still heavy, still stuck in everything that had just happened to her. But something in his tone made her listen more closely. The waiter hesitated, then continued, almost like he didn't mean to say it out loud. "They keep asking questions. About someone born around the same time as you. I heard them mention dates, hospitals, things like that." He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes widened slightly as if he suddenly realized what he had just revealed. His mouth closed quickly, and he looked away from Lila like he regretted even standing there. "Sorry. I shouldn't be talking about this," he muttered. Before Lila could respond or ask anything, he straightened up, turned his body toward the door, and quickly stepped back inside the restaurant. The door swung shut behind him, cutting off whatever explanation might have followed. Lila stayed still on the bench, staring at the door for a moment. Her thoughts felt scattered, like pieces that didn't fit together yet but were refusing to stay separate. The words he had said kept repeating in her mind. Not clearly, not fully understood, but enough to leave a strange pressure in her chest. Inside the restaurant, that reunion table suddenly felt even more important than before, but she couldn't explain why. Lila was still sitting outside, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of everything when she heard footsteps coming from the side of the restaurant. She didn't look up at first, assuming it was just another waiter or guest stepping out for air. But the footsteps stopped right in front of her. Slowly, she lifted her head. The same woman from the reunion table was standing there. Up close, she looked even more unsettled than before. Her hands were slightly shaking, and her face looked tense, like she was holding back something painful. She didn't sit down or move closer. She just stood there for a few seconds, staring at Lila like she was trying to confirm something in her mind. The air between them felt heavy, almost uncomfortable. Then, very softly, the woman spoke. Lila. It wasn't loud. It was almost like she was testing the name, like saying it out loud for the first time in years felt difficult. Her voice broke slightly in the middle, and she quickly looked away as if she had made a mistake. Lila froze. Hearing her name from a stranger's mouth like that made her feel strange inside, like something deep in her chest had shifted but she didn't know why. The woman swallowed hard and shook her head slightly. I'm sorry, she said quickly, her voice now uneven. I shouldn't have said anything. Her eyes were glossy, like tears were building, but she was forcing herself not to let them fall. She took a small step back, still not fully turning away from Lila. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say more. Her lips parted slightly, and her hands tightened at her sides, but no words came out. It was like something inside her was fighting against speaking. Lila wanted to ask who she was, why she knew her name, and why she was crying, but the words didn't come out either. Her throat felt tight, like her voice was stuck somewhere between confusion and fear. The woman finally broke eye contact. She turned her head toward the restaurant door, as if remembering she wasn't supposed to be here. Then, without another word, she quickly walked back inside. Lila stayed still, watching her disappear through the glass doors. But the sound of her voice saying her name didn't leave. It kept echoing in her mind in a way that felt strangely familiar, like it belonged somewhere in her life. Even though she had never heard it before, Lila couldn't sit still anymore after everything she had heard and seen. The words from the waiter, the woman's voice, and the strange behavior from that table kept replaying in her mind. It all felt connected in a way she couldn't explain. That night, she went back to her small apartment and couldn't sleep at all. She kept thinking about hospital records, names, and the way people reacted to her. The next morning, she decided to look into it herself. She started with the only thing she had, her old adoption papers. Most of it was basic information, but one line stood out more than the rest. It mentioned that her adoption was handled privately through direct arrangement. She had never paid attention to that before, but now it felt strange. She called the hospital listed in the documents, pretending she needed general birth information. After several attempts and long holds, she finally reached someone willing to check archived records. The woman on the phone sounded hesitant and asked her to come in person. 2 days later, Lila sat in a quiet hospital office, holding a thin file folder that didn't feel important at first. But when she opened it, her hands went cold. Inside were incomplete records from 25 years ago. There were notes about a maternity ward incident, something involving newborn identification errors during a shift change. The documents were partially redacted, but one detail was clear enough to make her heart drop. 2 babies had been mistakenly switched during early discharge processing. Her eyes stayed on the page longer than they should have. She read it again and again, hoping she misunderstood it. But the words didn't change. Another document mentioned a follow-up investigation that was never fully completed due to administrative pressure at the time. Names were missing, but one thing was clear: the case was quietly closed without full confirmation for all families involved. Lila leaned back in her chair, feeling like the room had become too small. She asked the staff if there was anything else, and after a long pause, the woman hesitated before saying that one family had been searching for a missing daughter for years but had never received answers. That sentence stayed with her as she left the hospital. Walking outside, Lila suddenly felt like her entire life had been built on something incomplete, something that had never been fully explained. The Harrington family had not chosen that restaurant by chance. For them, it was the result of months of searching, small clues, and broken leads that kept pointing back to Chicago. After years of silence from hospitals and officials, they finally found a former staff member who remembered something unusual from 25 years ago. That old nurse had mentioned a private arrangement involving a newborn girl and a couple who insisted on handling everything quietly. She didn't have full records, but she remembered a name connected to the adoption file and the general area where the family had settled. That was enough for them to start narrowing things down. Over time, they tracked locations tied to those names, visiting places that had even the smallest connection. One detail stood out from a recovered phone note, a reservation made years ago by the adoptive family at a well-known Chicago restaurant for special occasions. It was not proof, but it was the closest lead they had in a long time. So the Harringtons decided to return there on the same date they believed their daughter might unknowingly be nearby. It wasn't planned as a confrontation. It was meant to be a quiet presence, a way to observe and maybe recognize someone who might resemble the child they lost. They chose a table slightly away from the center, trying not to draw attention. They had been sitting there for hours. Every time the door opened, their attention shifted. Every young woman who entered made their hearts tighten for a moment, only to let go again when it wasn't her. Hope and disappointment kept repeating in silence. Then everything changed. At a nearby table, a scene unfolded that none of them could have imagined. A young woman, shaken and humiliated, was suddenly being pushed out of her own birthday celebration. The Harrington family didn't understand what they were witnessing at first. It just looked like a painful personal moment. But then they saw her face more clearly. Something about her expression, her age, and even the way she carried herself made the entire table go still. The hope they had been quietly holding on to for years suddenly collided with a moment of confusion and disbelief. They had come looking for a daughter they thought might be nearby. But they never expected to find her like this, sitting just a few tables away, being erased from a life she didn't even know might not fully belong to her. Lila hesitated outside for a long time before finally going back inside the restaurant. She didn't want to, but she knew her purse and phone were still at the table. Every step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last, like she was walking back into a place that had already rejected her. When she pushed the door open, the warm air hit her again, along with the same uneasy silence that still lingered in the room. Some guests were still pretending not to stare, but the attention had not disappeared. It followed her the moment she stepped in. At her old table, George and Patricia were still sitting, speaking quietly but refusing to look at her. Lila avoided them and walked straight toward the chair where she had been sitting earlier. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse, trying to finish quickly and leave again. But before she could turn around, movement came from the other side of the room. The Harrington family had stood up. They didn't speak at first. They just watched her carefully as she stood there, like they were trying to confirm something they had been doubting all night. The woman from earlier had tears in her eyes again, and the man beside her looked pale, like he had lost his balance emotionally. Lila noticed them staring and felt a strange discomfort, but she didn't understand why. Then one of them stepped forward slowly. It was the same woman who had whispered her name outside. Her voice was shaky as she spoke again, but this time louder. Wait. The entire room seemed to hold still again. She raised her hand slightly, pointing not at Lila's face, but at her wrist. Her fingers were trembling as she got closer, as if she was afraid of what she might find. Lila instinctively pulled her sleeve back just a little. And that's when it happened. A small, faint birthmark was visible on her wrist. Not something she had ever thought much about. Just a soft mark she had lived with her whole life. But the moment the Harrington woman saw it, her entire expression changed. Her breath broke, and she covered her mouth like she had just seen something impossible. That's, she whispered, her voice breaking completely. That's hers. The man beside her stepped forward too, staring at the mark like it was proof of something he had waited his entire life to confirm. The air in the room shifted instantly. George and Patricia stood up sharply, confused and suddenly alert. They didn't understand what was happening, but the tension between both sides of the room turned sharp and dangerous in seconds. Lila stood frozen in the middle, caught between two families looking at her like she belonged to both, and yet didn't fully belong to either. The room stayed silent for what felt like an endless moment after the birthmark was shown. No one moved at first, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to explain what it meant. Then the Harrington family rushed forward, their emotions no longer under control. The woman who had spoken earlier was shaking as she reached for Lila's hand, holding it like she was afraid it might disappear again. Lila didn't understand what was happening until a hospital official who had been called earlier arrived with sealed documents. The envelope was opened carefully, and the words inside changed everything. A DNA confirmation report clearly stated that Lila was the biological daughter of the Harrington family. The sound of it felt unreal. The Harrington man stepped back for a second, covering his face as his shoulders dropped. Years of searching, waiting, and hoping came crashing down all at once. The woman let out a broken cry and pulled Lila into her arms without thinking. It wasn't planned or controlled, it was pure emotion, like something inside her had finally been returned. Lila stood still inside the hug, her body stiff, her mind struggling to catch up. She could hear the Harringtons whispering her name like they had been saving it for years. Across the room, George and Patricia had gone completely silent. Their faces had changed from anger to shock, then to something closer to fear. The confidence they had shown earlier was gone. Now they looked like people who were realizing that everything they had built was about to collapse. Guests in the restaurant were no longer whispering. They were watching everything unfold like a scene they could not believe was real. The Harrington family slowly pulled back and looked at Lila with tears still in their eyes. They spoke softly, telling her she didn't have to stay there anymore. That she could come with them. Lila looked at them, then turned her head slightly toward George and Patricia. They didn't speak. They couldn't. The power they once had over her was gone in a single moment. For a long time, she just stood there, caught between two lives. Then, slowly, she picked up her bag. Without saying a word, Lila walked toward the Harrington family. They didn't rush her. They just waited, as if afraid to break the moment. As she reached them, they surrounded her gently, guiding her toward the exit. Behind her, George and Patricia remained seated in silence, watching the consequences of everything they had done finally settle in. Lila walked out of the restaurant with her birth family, leaving behind the only life she had ever known.